I just mess everything up for you? Okay. I forgot that we're doing the dual mic now. Okay, we're okay. All right. If I could have everyone gather. It's an intimate crowd, so feel free to come forward. I'm Marvin Pinkert, director of the Jewish Museum of Maryland, and I come to the podium tonight not only to introduce our speaker, but to express my gratitude. When I came back from the museum conference in Atlanta on Wednesday, I came back to a city that was still shaking. Shaking from a lack of justice and shaking from a fear of lawlessness. It was completely unclear that tonight's Sadie B. Feldman lecture could even be held. But the people of Baltimore came together to find a better way to continue the struggle for a society that's both just and peaceful. I'm grateful for everyone who had the courage to speak out against the mistreatment of our citizens, and I'm grateful for everyone who had the courage to calm the violence. And I'm most grateful to all of you. You've chosen to come here tonight and tell the world that Baltimore and this historic Jonestown neighborhood is still a great place to visit, to learn, and to discover. And it seems to me that the best way to show our gratitude is to offer you more. You're getting a Mother's Day break, but we'd love to see you back here for one or both of two great programs we're organizing for Sunday, May 17th. At 9 a.m., we plan to hold our ultimate Mendes Cohen Experience bus tour. The tour begins with a visit to Baltimore Hebrew Cemetery on Bel Air Drive to see Mendes' grave and to explore some of the other early 19th century stories represented in those stones. Later, we will make our way to Johns Hopkins University Archaeology Museum, where a curator will take us behind the scenes to see the Cohen collection, not the one at the BMA, the other Cohen collection of Egyptian artifacts. And finally, we will make our way to the Maryland Historical Society, whose director, Bert Kummerow, is pulling out plans and materials from the building of Washington's monument, Baltimore's Washington Monument, which you may recall was paid for by the Cohen Lottery. Our original request for this tour was $20 for members and $30 for non-members, with 50% of the proceeds going to the Associated's Fund for rebuilding damaged parts of the city. But we are so interested in filling this bus that those of you who are with us tonight and any friends you see tomorrow can come for a voluntary payment of any amount you wish. Just sign up with Trillion. Later that day, we are collaborating with the Center for Jewish Education and the Embassy of Israel on the Puzzle Project. The Puzzle Project, inspired and created by New York artist Tim Kelly, allows art to be easily accessible to anyone that wants to create personally meaningful work. Students participating in the program are expressing themselves individually and collectively on their shared vision of what Israel means to them by using blank 18 by 18 puzzle pieces. And if you think about it, that's a perfect match with the Mendes Cohen exhibit with all of its puzzle pieces. This is only going to be on display for 10 days, so I encourage you to come and visit. Speaking of short-term projects, can you imagine the shortest time it would take to put an exhibit together? Well, we just set a JMM record. If you didn't notice it when you came in, I invite you to look at the special display in every generation at the back of the room. The pop-up exhibit features documents and artifacts from our collection related to more than 150 years of Baltimore Jewish participation in the struggle for justice and human rights. The project was started by a staff team led by Registrar Joanna Church last Thursday and was completed in less than 7 days. It includes 2 posters from last Saturday's demonstrations, and it is still a work in progress. We're inviting people to add artifacts to this, to bring into the museum, but I want to congratulate my team for an incredibly quick, nimble response. And it is that theme in every generation that takes us back to tonight's presentation. A couple of years ago, New York Times museum critic Ed Rothstein came to a conference of the Council of American Jewish Museums. And in his keynote address, chastised the members of our group for promoting the content we had. He said one memorable part of his critique was that Jewish museums did not give enough space to the views of rabbis and scholars, choosing instead to represent the experience of everyday Jewish people, putting quotes on the walls from doctors or labor leaders or musicians, or, and I'm quoting here, even housewives. Well, Mr. Rothstein, my message for the week is that every life matters. And those housewives made a Jewish life in America possible. Tonight we turn our attention to single mom Judith Solomon Cohen and all the other brave Jewish women who stood as pioneers in early America. Our distinguished guide for this journey is Dr. Pamela S. Nadell. Dr. Nadell holds the Patrick Clendenen Chair in Women's and Gender History and is chair of the Department of History and director of the Jewish Studies program. Her books include Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination from 1889 to 1985, published by Beacon Press in 1998, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. Her new book, co-edited with AU professor Kate Haulman, is Making Women's Histories, Beyond National Perspectives, published by New York University Press in 2013. Her consulting work for museums includes the Library of Congress and our colleagues at the National Museum of American Jewish History on Philadelphia's Independence Mall. I've been looking forward to this lecture since we opened the exhibit last September. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Pam Nadell.
Good evening. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? I think normally I would like to move around, but I think because they're taping, I have to stay right here. Is that right, Trillian? Yeah. Fairly close. That's what I figured. First of all, again, thank you to Marvin for that lovely introduction, and especially a thank you to the Jewish Museum of Maryland for organizing this event, to Carolyn Bevins and Trillian Atwood, who were so terrific in helping make all the arrangements for me, to the family of Sadie B. Feldman, who has supported this lecture, and most of all, as Marvin thanked you, I want to thank you for coming back and showing that Baltimoreans are taking back their city. Our topic for this evening is really far removed from the violence and the turmoil of the tensions of last week. Instead, in keeping with the spirit of this museum's current exhibition, which I hope you've seen, the A-Mazing Mendes Cohen, I've been invited to share with you some thoughts this evening about America's early Jewish women. Let me just get this and make sure, there we are. So here's, you can see if you go in there later on, you'll be able to see the A-Mazing Mendes Cohen, and you'll also, if you go through the exhibit, as I learned earlier, you can actually see the jacket that he's wearing there, which is really an extraordinary artifact. So we know a tremendous amount about Mendes Cohen. We know that he defended Fort McHenry during the War of 1812. We know that he was at Queen Victoria's coronation, that he traveled to Palestine, that he traveled to Egypt, that he brought back antiquities, that he gave them, as you just heard, to Johns Hopkins University, starting their museum collection. I mean, this remarkable, extraordinary, colorful figure. Most men don't lead lives like the A-Mazing Mendes Cohen, and I haven't been asked to talk about him. I've been asked to talk about the women of his days and to use what I could find out about the life of his mother as my kind of hook into him. So his mother was Judith Cohen, and you can see her dates, and you can see his dates there as well. So we're going to talk about early America's Jewish women. Judith Cohen was born in 1766, not in the colonies, by the way, and she died in 1837. And I should kind of tell you where this project is coming from. So this is actually based on a book that I'm currently writing about a big history of the Jewish women of America. And this comes very much from the very first chapter where I talk about the first women to come to America. And I was telling Trillian, I haven't given this talk before, so I very much really want your feedback. And I also ended up kind of plugging Judith in to some other material. So I want to take you back. I want to go back to the very first Jewish women who came to the Americas, at least to the mainland of the Americas, back in 1654. And so who really paved the way for people like Judith Solomon Cohen. So in September of 1654, 23 Jewish souls, big as well as little, landed in a place that then was called New Amsterdam. And this is this map is dated from just a few years after they landed. You see that broad street coming out? So that's Broadway in the lower part of Broadway in New York, and the wall is supposed to be separating lower Manhattan is supposed to be Wall Street. So this is the world that they came to. They came to a thriving urban seaport. One account tells us that of the 23 Jews on this ship, females actually outnumbered males 6-4. The rest were children and young people, and we actually know the names of 2 of the women. And the reason we know that is because the passengers were so poor, they were fleeing from Brazil, and they couldn't pay their fare, and the ship's captain sued them. And because of the lawsuit, we have the record of their names. And that's how Rika Nunes and Judith Mercado claimed their place in what historians of a previous generation like to call the Jewish Pilgrim Fathers, and we don't tend to use that term so much anymore. So we don't have any images of them, but what I do have is this, which I love. This is a fabulous image. It probably comes from a calendar the provenance is not totally clear, but probably from a calendar in 1954, so I'm guessing it was like, something like Manischewitz gave it out, and 1954 was the year of the anniversary, the 300th anniversary of the landing of these Jews in America, and so they imagine the 23 coming on board, remember lots of young people, and they imagine them coming and landing and carrying a Torah scroll, and they're all incredibly well dressed, and I can tell you none of this is correct. But they paved the way. So over the next 100 years or so, the American Jewish community grows really, really slowly. Just to give you kind of a perspective, by the eve of the Revolution, so from 1654 to, let's say, 1775, we're talking about maybe 2,500 Jews in the United States. So when we talk about Judith Solomon Cohen being here, she's one of a very small group of Jews. So what do we know about Judith Solomon Cohen? So we know that she was born in 1766, but we don't know where, and we don't know where she lived. So we do know that 20 years later, she was living in Bristol, England, because that's where she got married. And so we have a record, we have records of her marriage. Bristol had been actually a very important medieval Jewish community. And then, of course, when the Jews were expelled from England in 1290, there were no more Jews there. It reemerged as a Jewish community only in 1750. And in fact, it dedicated its first permanent house of prayer in 1786. And it's possible, I mean, you just kind of have to use your imagination, maybe that's where Judith Solomon married Israel Cohen in December of 1786. We don't know, but you know, they could have gotten married in a home as well, but certainly her family must have been involved with that. But it gives you a sense of how tenuous, how young that community was, and also the fact that, you know, maybe she was born there, but if she was born in what was essentially a brand new community. That synagogue, we don't have images of it. The synagogue still exists under various other names and iterations. But back at the end of the 18th century, people in Bristol had described it as one of the handsomest places of worship in all of Bristol. So we know a little bit more about her husband, Israel. He was born in Oberdorf, Germany, and he was 16 years older than his bride. Now today, we would be shocked at that a man 16 years older than a bride, as one who was, you know, she was so young, she was just 20, but in those days, that was not at all unusual. So here I have some very famous portraits of Bilhah Abigail Levi Franks and Jacob Franks, and he was 8 years older. Sorry about that, I lost the was there. He was 8 years older than her when they married, and that wasn't seen as unusual at all. What we do know is that by the time Israel Cohen married Judith Cohen, Judith Solomon making her Judith Cohen, he had already scoped out Richmond, Virginia as a place to live. And the reason we know that is 2 years before they married, that he had been in Richmond at the courthouse, and he had signed a oath of loyalty to the Commonwealth, and that had made him a citizen of Richmond. So then he goes back to Europe. I have to assume, actually, that he went from Richmond, this is a little bit later, but that he goes from Richmond. I think we have to assume that he probably went back to Germany to stop, and then somehow ends up in Bristol, where he finds himself a bride. Now, this is a super common pattern for early American Jews. I'll give you a couple of other examples. So she's one of my favorite figures. This is Fanny Brooks. This is from the National Museum of American Jewish History. And Fanny was 15 years old, so she's much younger than Judith. This is in the middle of the 19th century. She's 15 years old, and Julius Brooks comes back to Germany. He's been a businessman. He's done very well in America, and he meets up with Fanny, and he's basically gone home to find a bride. And she says to him, all of 15 years old, she says, "I want to go to America with you." And he turns to her and he says, "Well, I don't think your parents are going to let us do that if we're not married." So she says, "Okay, so we'll get married." And she comes to America, and we think she's the first Jewish woman to cross the plains in a covered wagon. But again, he was much older than she was. So the pattern of Judith Cohen and Israel Cohen is not at all unusual. And I had the same pattern also with Abigail, as we saw before. So what was it that drew Julius and his bride, because they set sail within the year of their marriage, to come to Richmond? He had a brother who was in business there, so you have to imagine that the brother is really kind of dragging him, propelling him to come over to work. But you also have to think about the world of Europe at that time. Jews were literally locked behind ghetto walls, but the Jews of America's early republic were finding a remarkable degree of freedoms and toleration. They mingled with their neighbors, they did business with them, they even socialized in one another's homes. We'll see Abigail again a little bit later, and we'll hear more about that. But at the center of these homes, whether they were Christian or Jewish in America, stood their women. So on the surface, the lives of early America's Jewish women, like these women, mirrored that of their neighbors. They got married. They had children. When they had those children, they faced death. In the colonies, 1 in 5 women died in childbirth. They raised their children, at least the ones that survived. They cooked, they washed, they fed their households. Maybe a lot of them did it with help. Certainly Abigail Levy Franks had help. The dozens of portraits painted of women like her show us this. I mean, look at her gown. It's an extraordinary gown. I've actually seen the original of this. And it's stunning, but also look at how she's dressed. Look at her, décolletage. I mean, she's not dressed the way, we would think Jewish modesty laws would certainly demand. She's dressed just like other well-to-do colonial women. And she and other of America's early women really saw themselves as a part of, rather than apart from, the colonial society that they lived in, or the early Republican society that they lived in. But something about the society was very different than the world that America's later Jewish women would encounter. This was a society where religion permeated all discourse, underlay all thought, marked all observances, and gave meaning to public and private life. And this, I think, conveys it. This is a map, a very famous map of New York City. It's from 1813, and what's a little hard to see, but at the top of this map, these are all the houses of worship. And then the detail on the right is that, I think it's the third from the right, is the detail of the Mill Street Synagogue, the synagogue the first synagogue founded in America in New York in 1730. The first one that was built, the synagogue was actually founded earlier. But I want you to imagine what the skyline of New York or Baltimore would have looked like at the beginning of the 19th century. And it was dotted by the spires of churches that you walked out of your house and you knew you were living in a religious world. And so that meant that for Jewish men and women, Jewish practices, Jewish customs, and especially for the Jewish women, their gendered responsibilities shaped their lives and their families and set them apart from their Christian neighbors. So let's go into let's go really early back. Let's go into a colonial Jewish woman's home. Now, how do we do that? We do it with something called inventories, which were made when someone died and they left property behind. These inventories were recorded what was in the home. And so I want to talk about, this is not an example of that one, it's just an example of an inventory. I want to talk about the inventory from 1702, so before Judith Cohen was born, of New York's Judah Samuel. Now, this is only the second inventory that we have left by a colonial Jew, and it's his legacy, it's Judah Samuel's legacy to history. But if you read that inventory with the eyes of a scholar of women's history, you also see that it is the legacy of the modest life of his wife, Rachel Hendrick Samuel. We think that Rachel died before her husband because his inventory lists a woman's possessions. Perhaps both of them fell victim to smallpox, for in the spring of 1702, it had claimed the lives of 500 people in New York. So what do we have left from Rachel? So the inventory lists a woman's gown, a petticoat, an apron. These aren't their artifacts, but it gives you a sense. A handkerchief, and we'll see 2 brass candlesticks. We know other things. We know she wore stays, because that's in the inventory. We know that in her kitchen there was a kettle, there was a tankard. You'll see in the exhibit, you'll see the wine cooler. This is a much more modest home I'm talking about now. It doesn't have cut glass and a wine cooler. She had a frying pan. She had a pair of shears. She must have done her sewing at a straw table or a straw chair sitting by a table. So far, nothing sets their home apart from that of their neighbors who were in the same kind of position as they were. But I think these candlesticks might, and I know that the Hebrew Bible and the 5 prayer books that were part of her husband's inventory did. So we have to imagine that she, because he was religiously observant enough to own those objects, remember this is an era when people did not have a lot of possessions, that probably these candlesticks, or something similar to these brass candlesticks, probably were ones that she lit on the eve of Sabbaths and the holidays. But she did that only for 42 years, because that's how old she was when she died. In these colonial homes, women were busy from dawn until dark. I mean, just think about it. Actually, every time I write about this period, I'm just astonished at what was involved. They were spinning, they were weaving, they were dyeing, they were knitting, they were sewing, they were washing. To cook, they had to roast, they had to fry, boil, bake. They pickled and preserved, and they didn't just do it because it was kind of trendy to do in the summer. They had to tend the hearth. They had to fetch the water. They had to make soap and candles. They had to churn butter, made cheese, hoed the garden, raised the chickens. It's an exhausting list to imagine what it took to sustain their families. And this is true for Jewish women and Christian women. It's why I said they're at the center of their homes. And they did much of this by themselves, but we know in the Cohen family that they had help. Because in seaports, it would have been just taken for granted that there would have been either servants or slaves. There's a court document that tells us that the Cohens had some kind of servant trouble. This is when they were living in Richmond. A man named Solomon Raphael had somehow detained a woman named Frances Rubin, an apprentice girl, that's from the court document, to Israel I. Cohen, and he was ordered to return her to Israel Cohen and to her said master, quote, and Judith Cohen. And I have to say that I find in the court document the use of the first name Judith absolutely astonishing, because typically in this era, and well actually into the 20th century, married women were always known as Mrs. Israel Cohen, and the fact that they would have used the return to her said master and Judith Cohen really jumped out at me. So we have to assume that we know that the Cohens had servants when they were living in Baltimore, because we saw that in the exhibit, but they also had them when they were living in Richmond, and they could well have also had slaves, both in Baltimore and in Richmond. So Judith Cohen gets married, and we don't know if she actually ever followed the rules and regulations that require a Jewish woman to immerse in a mikveh and regulate sexual relations between husband and wife. And we don't have evidence of a mikveh in Richmond. We do have evidence, and this is just one example, there are others, of mikvaot, the ritual baths, in other colonies in the New World, so that it's possible that she would have immersed in a mikveh. She's described by later commentators as being someone who was very pious. But we have no way really of knowing. I can tell you that not until 1786 does the Jewish community in Philadelphia actually build a mikveh. I don't know whether or not when Baltimore builds one, but as one of my friends who's a great historian commented, by the time in Philadelphia they got around to building the mikveh, the women probably weren't using it because they hadn't been using it for decades before, so they had no interest in using it. So we don't know about that. What we do know is that marriage meant children. And this is going to sound, just so simplistic, but the younger the bride, the more children, right? So family size would depend on the age of the bride. The average 18th century family, Jewish family, had 5 or 6 children, but some had none and some had many more. Judith Solomon Cohen had 10. This comes from Malcolm Stern's genealogy, so it's a little hard to see. But I should tell you, she didn't hold the record for Jewish women of her era. In 1805, Tzipora Levi Seiches, Mrs. Benjamin Seiches, gave birth to the last of her 21 children. A girl named Leah, and one of her neighbors quipped, they have almost gone through the names of the Bible. Like they had no more. So family, that remained at the center of Jewish women's lives in the past, as it did then, and as it would down until today. Women raised, they educated, they married off their children. They nursed them when they were sick. They buried them when they died, and that was a fate not uncommon in this era. So Judith Cohen's first and last children died. The first one died at the age of 2.5 months. The last one died at about a year, and the third one, I, Solomon, we don't know. He's born in 1791, says living in Richmond, and we don't know what happened to him, but we do know that by the time Judith Cohen comes to Baltimore, he's not with them. It's possible that he remained behind, but we just really don't know anything about him. But I want to say something about her childbearing patterns, because it speaks to the reality of colonial and early American women's lives, so, as historians called, their phrase was, so often brought to bed. They spent a good portion of their fertile adult lives either pregnant or nursing. And Judith Cohen she must not have been nursing her children generally, because usually when you look at the patterns, if they were nursing their children, then the children are showing up about every 2 years. And actually, by the 18th century in France, they surmise that nursing suppresses ovulation. So there are people who are writing about this, but she's having some of her kids every year. And actually, Abigail Levy Franks is my much better example, because she has children every other year, and then clearly after they're better off, they're coming, and so she must have a wet nurse. They're coming every year. But Judith Cohen was 36 when she gave birth to her 10th child. 6 days after baby Edward died, at about the age of a year, her husband Israel died. And he left behind a widow with 7, possibly 8 children. The eldest, Joshua, was just 15. So if in making homes and caring for their families and burying their children, early America's Jewish women were absolutely indistinguishable from their neighbors, in the economic sphere, they were remarkably different. The prototypical American male of the early days was either a farmer or a trader. But America's earliest Jewish men were by and large merchants. And with husbands away at sea or traveling on business, the wives had to step into business affairs. Now, this is not unique to Jewish women. The great historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich talks about Hannah Grafton, who's torn between the baby Priscilla crying upstairs and the shop bell ringing downstairs. But it's much, much more common for America's Jewish women. They were, as Ulrich called them, they became deputy husbands. When their husbands were away, they were in charge of the business. And a woman with a knack for business could double for her husband, greatly extending his economic interests. So there's no question that Jewish women's economic activities set them apart from other of America's women. But we don't know is what brought Judith Cohen to Baltimore, and were there economic considerations involved? Because she stays in Richmond for about, I think it's about 3 years before she leaves Richmond for Baltimore. So just imagine what it was like to be a widow in Richmond. She did have her brother-in-law there. But what was she doing to keep that family of 7 children together? And then what brings them to Baltimore? I would assume, and we were talking earlier, I would assume that it was some kind of economic considerations. By the time she comes, her eldest child is 15, so maybe it's a sense Baltimore is burgeoning. It's a seaport. It's becoming the 3rd largest city in America, and maybe Richmond feels more like a sleepy backwater town, but we don't really know. One historian conjectures that she wanted to enroll her children in Baltimore College, a non-sectarian school. I don't know where he got that from, so we have no way of knowing, but it's clearly a really important question. So her eldest son, Jacob, he engages in business when he comes to Baltimore, and you can read more about that in the exhibit. But I'm really interested in what widows did, not so much in Jacob now, but in what widows were doing to sustain their families and business. So what we know from other 18th and 19th century women, we have a list of things that they did. They imported rum from St. Thomas. They sold dry goods in Newport. They reaped revenue from property. They held land. They held slaves, horses, cattle, and sheep. They ran taverns. They even managed urban real estate. And Jewish women did all of these things. Those are all examples from Jewish women, but they also used their housekeeping skills to earn a living. So in 1780, Shina Solomon Edding, who was a widow with 8 children, moved from York, Pennsylvania to Baltimore to open a kosher boarding house for gentlemen. By the way, Mendes' older brother, Benjamin, marries into the Edding family. But other women sold preserves, furniture, groceries, took in washing, ironing. They did whatever they could to earn a living. So why is it that I'm saying widows are employed, are working? So I think there are 2 reasons. One, but they're no longer bearing children. They may be raising them, but they're no longer bearing them once they become a widow, and they have to support their families. But there's a larger legal issue underlying this. So there's something in 18th and 19th century America called coverture. I don't know if you've ever heard this concept, the law of infancy and coverture. So what it rested on a legal fiction of marital unity, so that a husband covered most of his wife's civil rights. So basically, when a woman got married, it ended her separate civil legal existence. By the way, it's not until the 1970s that a married woman can get credit in her own name in the United States. I mean, we have remnants of coverture lasting until the second wave of American feminism. So what it meant was that a married woman couldn't own property, couldn't sign a legal document, couldn't enter into a contract, couldn't start a lawsuit, or even keep her wages unless her husband said it was okay. But an unmarried woman, whether she had never married and was no longer under the aegis of her father, or whether she was a widow, actually had a different legal stance. She was a femme sole, a solo woman, and she had the freedom to act as a sole trader and could own property and sign contracts, which meant she could import things, and she could sell them, and she could conduct business affairs. Now, I don't want you to think that all widows prospered, even though I have some examples of ones who did. By the time Martha Lazarus Moravia died in Newport, Rhode Island in 1787, she'd been taking charity from her synagogue for 6 years. From New York, an elderly Jewish widow pleaded, "I am helped by my friends, but it is not sufficient to keep me from greater distress than it is possible to express." So there's one other area where these Jewish women really stand apart, and I said religion. Even before Ricky Nunes and Judith Mercado came to America, to New Amsterdam, Anne Dudley Bradstreet, I don't know if this is a familiar name, maybe somebody that you would have studied when you were studying colonial history. She was the first woman poet in the colonies, and she memorialized her mother as, quote, a loving mother, a friendly neighbor, pitiful to the poor, a worthy matron, religious in all her words and ways. Religion permeated the lives of America's women, Christian and Jewish. In 1780, Savannah's Frances Sheftal closed a letter to her husband with the words, "Our Sabbath is coming on so fast." Now, what did that mean? Well, it meant that for observant Jews, that she, like Frances, and also like Abigail Levy Franks, because they write this, they had to stop writing their letters. They wouldn't write their letters on the Sabbath. So what I see is that for many Jewish women, not all, because there's a tremendous diversity among America's Jews, but that the rhythms of Jewish life, from Sabbath to Sabbath, from birth to death, from Rosh Hashanah to Rosh Hashanah, those govern the cadences of their life and their days. And what these did was they bound America's Jews, whether they were living in Baltimore or Richmond or Newport, to Jews all over the world who were functioning under the same kind of rules and systems and regulations. And so they created, in the words of the great historian Benedict Anderson, an imagined community. So the center of that community in America, in early America, was the synagogue. And so we can, again, kind of figure out what the life was like for Judith Cohen by peering into the synagogue that we saw not the Mill Street Synagogue, the one that we saw earlier in the earlier slide. There we know that women prayed in the synagogue. After it was built, they built a balcony with breastwork up to the chins of the women, because we have Christian observers going in and describing this, and that the women went to services. And we know about altercations. One day, it was on Yom Kippur, and one of the women brought her Christian neighbor, and they took the window out because it was so hot up in the balcony. You know what it's like in September in New York. And a thunderstorm hit, and everybody got soaked, and then they went and put the window back, and then there was an altercation between the men down below because the women upstairs, some were hot and some were wet. I don't think Judith Cohen was going to synagogue, however, in Richmond. Her husband was one of the founders of Kahal Kadosh Beth Shalom, which was established in 1789, so just shortly after they've landed there. What's interesting about that synagogue is that most of the members were surely Ashkenazic Jews, but they created a synagogue that followed the Sephardic rite. And they did that because all the early American synagogues followed the Sephardic rite. Also, interestingly, the prayer book that they used in that synagogue, it was from 1797, remember the revolutions in 1776, it had a prayer for our most gracious sovereign, Lord King George, and all the members of the royal family. So in its early years, the synagogue met on 19th Street in a room in some building. And I can't imagine that the women went and worshipped there. They wouldn't have had a balcony for them. And also, basically, we know what Judith Cohen was doing while she was in Richmond, was having all those children. So by the time there's a permanent building, which might have had a women's gallery, Judith Cohen had already decamped for Baltimore with her children. So, but she did display her religiosity in other ways. So we know that for some of America's Jewish women, keeping kosher was of paramount importance. We have to believe that the Cohens did that. There's also attention to that in the exhibit. And we know how important it was from Abigail Levy Franks, so I'm coming back to her. We'll kind of, maybe I'll talk about these as well, but Abigail Abigail's son, Naphtali, sailed to England, and Abigail was the great letter writer of colonial Jewry. And in fact, you'll love this. When the letters were first published in the 60s, they were called the Letters of the Franks family, even though all but 2 of the letters were written by Abigail Levy Franks. When they were republished in the 2000s, the new editor called them the Letters of Abigail Levy Franks. So she wrote to Naphtali, and he was staying with her brother. And she saw in a letter of his that he had not gone to a fish dinner at her brother's house. And here's her response. By the way, this is her spelling. I desire you will never eat anything with him unless it be bread and butter, nor nowhere else where there is the least doubt of things not done after our strict Judaical method. In other words, she didn't trust her brother's kashrut. He probably didn't keep kosher, and she didn't want him eating there. Abigail was a remarkable woman. She actually, in the second quotation, because she's interested in religion and she's observant, she says, I heartily wish a Calvin or Luther would rise amongst us. She's absolutely bored with synagogue services and wants them reformed. But she also had a very painful life, because when her daughter Phila married outside the faith, her spirit was crushed, so depressed that it was a pain to speak or see anyone. And she actually left the city for Flatbush. It was 2 words, Flatbush, in Brooklyn, and resolved never to see her daughter again. And we don't know if she ever did. Her husband interceded, but we don't know what happened. Let me go back to kashrut for a second. Kashrut was so important for some that in 1774, when Hetty Hayes suspected that the lamb that she had bought from the ritual slaughterer, the shachet, at the synagogue in New York, the one I showed you the picture of, that it had not been properly treated, the synagogue did an investigation, decided that they didn't have enough to charge the shachet with anything, but because Hetty Hayes ran a kosher boarding house, they had her this is a quote, do kosherer or properly cleanse all her spoons, plates, and all other her utensils used in her home, lest it be looked on as a trefo house. And you can imagine what it involved to clean all of those implements in 1774. So we have to assume that Judith Cohen kept kosher. She's described as a pious woman. And we know more about her religious life as well from 2 artifacts. This is a prayer that she wrote, a shorthand written note, I was told possibly sent to a son. I actually wondered if it was sent to a daughter-in-law when I looked at it. The text reads, not all legible, but to the supreme being we look up to for all earthly happiness. To him I offer up my fervent wishes for my grandchild's safe delivery of that offspring which you look forward to crown your existing happiness in conjunction with, and it's not totally legible, it looks to me like it's grand husband. Who is already blessed with reciprocal affection. And she continues, they're waiting for when the Almighty she is waiting for when the Almighty will bless you with a son or daughter. Praise your mother, Judith Cohen. So it's not clear who she's writing to, but it's a kind of prayer, and you see her religious sensibilities coming out. And the other was characteristic of Jewish women's charity. In 1827, she donated $5 to the Baltimore Female Orphan Asylum. Note this, it's not the Baltimore Jewish Female Orphan Asylum, it's the Baltimore Female Orphan Asylum. She was, like the famed Rebecca Gratz, a member of organizations, female benevolent organizations in her town that included Christians and Jews together. We won't have Jewish orphanages established until 1859, and when they're established, it's actually inspired by Gratz. So that's her life. On April 5th, 1837 in Baltimore, Judith Solomon Cohen, the Bristol bride, The Richmond wife and mother and the Baltimore widow died. She was buried in the family cemetery on West Saratoga Street, which doesn't exist any longer. All I have is a kind of 20th century image of Saratoga Street, an earlier one. And her life had come to an end. We have to imagine that her children mourned her as we know Jews have mourned women for generations. They would have recited Proverbs 31, "A woman of valor who can find, for her price is far above rubies." Surely that was said of Judith Solomon Cohen and of the myriads of America's early Jewish women who stood by their husband's side, made homes, raised families. Their lives may have not made for as gripping a story, as colorful as that of Mendes Cohen, our A-Mazing Mendes Cohen, but in their quiet ways, these women laid the foundations for the American Jewish community. And I'd like to close by saying, may their memories be for a blessing for us always. Thank you. We'll take questions.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I start with
Absolutely.
Because it's something I've been curious about. Do you know anything about the education? You know, her handwriting is better than Mendes, without a doubt.
Yeah.
And she also, Mendes writes to her sometimes phrases in Hebrew as well as English. Where did a woman acquire that kind of education at that time?
Well, we have to assume that she acquired, do you need, for the transcription, do you need the mic for asking questions or just the answers? Yeah, okay. Right. But you could all hear the question? Okay. So, so she's educated in Europe. Whether she's educated in Bristol or she's educated in you know, it's really possible that she came from Germany to England because it was such a young community. So 18th century Jewish women are getting, well-to-do Jewish women are getting education from private tutors. She wouldn't have gone to some kind of, I can't imagine that there was some kind of school, but she would have had tutors who would have taught her how to read and write. And I mean, maybe there was some kind of schooling as well. In terms of the Hebrew, again, if we knew more about her family, we'd probably have a better sense. But Jewish women, 18th century Jewish women are literate. So it's not surprising at all. Yeah. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first one is, could you explain what you mean by the Sephardic rite?
Oh, sure. Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, go ahead, and
Yeah. Okay, so Sephardic, R-I-T-E. Yeah. Jews are essentially sort of divided between Jews whose origins are in the Iberian Peninsula, who are the Sephardim, and Jews whose origins came out of Germany, who are the Ashkenazim. And the Sephardic rite, or the Sephardic synagogue ritual, is actually quite different than the Ashkenazic ritual. In terms of the prayers, in terms of customs and practices. So today, like often you'll see, like today, you'll find Jews today who will say, oh, now I follow the Sephardic pattern, and on Passover I eat rice, that kind of thing. So they have different customs, and their prayer books are also different, not tremendously so, and I'm not an expert on this, but in historians who work on this will be able to tell you certain prayers being, you know, either said differently. Certainly the vocalization and the sound is different as well. Yeah, and your others. Yeah.
Okay, so my second question is something very specific. The slide that you showed us was just kind of interesting to me because
Which one?
it was the one where they're coming off the ship with the because I noticed that there's a windmill way in the back.
Oh yeah.
I just wanted to know more about where that came from.
Well, it's because because it's New Amsterdam. So it's remember, it's New Amsterdam before it becomes New York. They land just in the author's mind. This is such a fabulous image. I wish I knew more about it. Whoever is imagining this is thinking, oh, Amsterdam, they have windmills, you know, so did they have windmills in New York? I don't know. What do you think? Did they? I mean, I have no idea. Yeah, yeah, it would really be, I mean, I got this from a historian friend of mine, and I don't know, I have no idea where it came from. Yeah.
But it is supposed to depict New Amsterdam.
It's supposed to, and so that's supposed to be the signal for New Amsterdam. I mean, I would have loved to have like seen somebody hanging this in their kitchen in 1954. You know, you would always get all those free, I don't know, so you don't, I mean, I get a few, but not like I used to, where I would get tons of free calendars every year as marketing tools. Yeah. You're welcome. Yes?
When I read the title of your lecture, I couldn't help but bring a little show and tell.
Oh, let's see.
Only because my mother-in-law passed away probably about 37 years ago, so she'd be way over 100 now. And supposedly, when she passed away, I took the only thing I wanted that represented her. And they were.
Oh, wow. Oh, they're beautiful.
And they're old, and they're polished, and waxed, and I will never clean them. This represents Shabbos every Friday.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's why I think.
Candlesticks. I had a brain.
Oh, that's so great. That's why I think that's why when I read the inventory, those two brass candlesticks just jumped out. I mean, obviously they had candlesticks because they had candles, but there was something about those two brass candlesticks.
When you hold them, you
Yeah.
feel.
Yeah, yeah. I use my late mother-in-law's. Yeah, yeah. Yes.
You talked about China Edding and Judith Cohen, both as widows, moving quite a distance from
Yeah.
from their home. Was that kind of geographic mobility common?
Yeah, I mean, after you see all the places Mendes Cohen went, you definitely see geographic. But for widows, I don't know. I mean, the answer is I really have no idea. There must, I mean, that's why, to me, the biggest puzzle is what brought her to Baltimore. I have to think that there was some kind of, you know, family connection. It's not like, I mean, many of her sons don't marry, so it's not like, you know, and the one who marries the Edding is later, so it's not, that's not what's bringing them there. What is it? What is it? But I mean, Abigail Levy Franks never leaves New York. Jews, they don't want to leave New York. But others moved around quite a bit, and there was a lot of mobility, and it wasn't that far to journey. You know, Richmond to Baltimore was not that far, but it is kind of daunting when you think of what it might have been like to pack up all those kids, and come up here. Yeah. Others. Yeah.
Could Judith have inherited her husband's wealth, or did it have to go to her son?
I don't know what American law on that is. My assumption is that she inherited it, that it didn't go directly to the son, but that would have rested not on Jewish law, which does allow daughters to inherit. I mean, we have examples from the Bible. But I don't know about whether or not it would have been, whether it would have gone directly to the son. Yeah, do you know?
My understanding is that it went to her son, that it would have gone to Jacob.
Really?
That's what we thought, that the law in Virginia, since she was not able.
Oh, wow. So it was Virginia law that so that would have given him. Right. So. Do you know? Did you find did you find records of how much there was? What they inherited? Did you find anything like that?
I am not sure. I'm not sure. We would have been a researcher who
Right.
determined that. There was an auction through
Mhm.
exhibit we had to notice that the
Right.
auction following
Yeah.
her husband's death. So I'm not sure if that produced the proceeds.
Right. But then they would have been translating property into cash because she needed the cash. Interesting. Really interesting. Well, thanks. I didn't know that. Other questions? Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Yeah. Thank you.
And if you haven't seen the exhibit, open for another.
Thank you. Nobody
I didn't realize there was so much information in Judith.
Well, it was amazing what I found. I had, as I said, I had the framework from this book, but I didn't, she's never been one of my examples, so I just kind of plugged her in. So I'm glad. No, I said that by the 18th century, by the 18th century, there were French women who had written, and the cancer was a phase of the United States, and they believed that dressing changed.
Yeah, I'll give you a card.